In the shadows of royal corridors where power whispers and secrets kill, one man's choice between loyalty and conscience would shake the very foundations of a kingdom. When palace guard Marcus Thornfield discovered what lay hidden behind the ornate doors of Catherine's chambers, he faced a decision that would either save an innocent woman's life or cost him everything he had sworn to protect.
This is not just another tale of royal intrigue. This is the true story of how a simple soldier's moment of defiance against his king would expose a web of deception, so dangerous that it threatened to topple a dynasty. In a world where disobedience meant death, Marcus chose to risk it all for a secret that could either destroy a queen or reveal the darkest truth about the man who wore the crown. Some stories are about heroes who sought glory.
This is about a man who never wanted to be remembered at all. The morning mist clung to the castle walls like ghostly fingers as Marcus Thornfield adjusted his leather armor and prepared for another day of duty.
He had served King Edmund's court for 7 years, rising from a common foot soldier to one of the trusted palace guards who protected the royal family's most private quarters. At 28, Marcus possessed the steady nerves and unwavering loyalty that made him valuable to the crown, but he had never imagined that his devotion would be tested in ways that would haunt him forever.
The Palace of Raven's Hollow stood like a monument to power, its towering spires piercing the gray English sky of 1847. Within its stone walls lived secrets that could topple governments and destroy lives with a single whispered word. Marcus had learned early in his service that a good palace guard heard nothing, saw nothing, and spoke of nothing that occurred behind the heavy oak doors he was sworn to protect.
Queen Catherine had arrived at court 3 years earlier as a bride of 17. Her marriage to the 45-year-old King Edmund arranged to secure peace between their neighboring kingdoms. She was beautiful in the way that made poets write verses and artists beg for the chance to capture her likeness, but Marcus had noticed something else about her that others seemed to miss.
Behind her carefully practiced smiles and graceful movements, he saw the shadow of fear that never quite left her green eyes. The first time Marcus had been assigned to guard the queen's private quarters, he had been struck by how different she seemed when she thought no one was watching. The regal bearing would slip from her shoulders like a discarded cloak, and she would move through her chambers with the tentative steps of someone who expected punishment around every corner. He had noticed the way she flinched when doors closed too loudly, how her hands would shake slightly when she reached for her teacup, and how she would often stare out her window for hours as if searching for something that would never come. King Edmund was a man who demanded absolute control over every aspect of his kingdom. From the way his ministers addressed him to the exact angle at which his servants bowed, he was intelligent and politically shrewd, having successfully negotiated treaties that expanded his territory and influence throughout Europe. However, those who served him closely knew that beneath his diplomatic exterior lay a temperament that could turn deadly without warning. Marcus had witnessed the king's rage only once, when a young page had accidentally dropped a tray of food near the throne. The boy's subsequent disappearance had taught everyone in the palace that the king's mercy was not something to be relied upon. The relationship between the royal couple appeared perfect to the outside world. They were often seen walking together in the palace gardens, attending court functions arm in arm, and exchanging what seemed to be loving glances during public ceremonies. The courtiers whispered about their apparent devotion to each other, and foreign ambassadors commented on the harmony of their union. But Marcus, standing silent and invisible in his post near the queen's chambers, had begun to see the cracks in this carefully constructed facade. He had started to notice patterns that troubled him. The queen would often retire to her chambers immediately after public appearances with the king, and Marcus could hear muffled sobbing through the thick walls. Sometimes he would see her the next morning with carefully applied cosmetics that seemed designed to conceal rather than enhance. There were occasions when she would request her meals be brought to her room, claiming illness, though Marcus suspected she was hiding marks that would raise questions she could not afford to answer. The turning point came on a rain-soaked evening in October, when Marcus was standing his usual post outside the queen's private sitting room. The king had visited her earlier, and their conversation had grown increasingly heated behind the closed door. Marcus had tried to ignore the raised voices, as he had been trained to do, but something in the queen's tone made him strain to listen despite his better judgment. "Please, Edmund, I cannot do what you ask of me." He heard Catherine's voice, trembling with desperation. "It would destroy innocent people. You will do exactly as I command, or you will face consequences that will make our previous disagreements seem gentle." The king's voice carried the cold menace that Marcus had learned to fear.
The conversation continued in hushed tones that Marcus could not make out, but when the king finally emerged from the room, his face was flushed with anger and his hands were clenched into fists.
He strode past Marcus without acknowledgement, leaving behind an atmosphere so thick with tension that it seemed to press against the walls themselves.
For several minutes, Marcus heard nothing from within the queen's chambers. Then came the sound that would change everything. A soft thud, followed by complete silence. Every instinct told him to remain at his post, to mind his own duties and ask no questions. But something deeper than training, something that spoke to his conscience rather than his oath, compelled him to act. Marcus knocked softly on the door. "Your Majesty, is all well?" When no answer came, he knocked again, louder this time.
Still silence. His hand moved to the door handle and he found it unlocked. Against every protocol he had ever been taught, he pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. Queen Catherine lay motionless on the floor beside her writing desk, her pale blue gown spread around her like spilled water. Trickle of blood ran from a cut on her forehead where she had apparently struck the corner of the desk as she fell. On the floor beside her lay a crumpled letter, its wax seal broken and its contents scattered. Marcus's training warred with his humanity for a precious few seconds before humanity won. He slipped into the room and knelt beside the unconscious queen, checking for signs of life. Her pulse was weak but steady, and her breathing shallow. As he gently lifted her head, his eyes fell upon the scattered contents of the letter that lay nearby. What he read in those hastily written lines would forever change his understanding of the royal court and place him in a position where loyalty to his king and protection of an innocent woman would become impossible to reconcile. The letter was addressed to someone named Thomas Whitmore, and it contained detailed information about the king's secret negotiations with French agents regarding the sale of English military positions along the Scottish border. But it was not the treasonous content that made Marcus's blood run cold. It was the realization that Queen Catherine had been forced to serve as the king's unwilling spy, using her connections to her birth kingdom to gather intelligence that Edmund could sell to the highest bidder. The letter in her handwriting contained information that would result in the deaths of soldiers who trusted their king to protect them. And the look of anguish on Catherine's unconscious face told Marcus that she knew exactly what her husband was forcing her to do. As consciousness slowly returned to the queen, Marcus made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of reporting the incident to his superiors as protocol demanded, he helped Catherine to her feet and waited for her to speak. When she realized what he had seen, terror filled her eyes, but Marcus spoke before she could beg for his silence. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "I have seen nothing, and I will say nothing. But you should know that you are not alone in this palace." The gratitude that flooded Catherine's face was mixed with a fear so deep that Marcus realized she had never expected kindness from anyone within these walls. In that moment, he understood that he had crossed a line from which there would be no return. He was no longer just a palace guard following orders. He had become an active participant in a game where the stakes were measured in lives and where his next move could save a queen or doom them both. As the days passed following that fateful evening, Marcus began to notice things he had never seen before, or perhaps had seen but refused to acknowledge. The way other guards would look away when the king's voice rose from the queen's chambers, the frequency with which court physicians were summoned to attend to Catherine's mysterious ailments. The careful way she moved through the palace as if every step might trigger some invisible trap. But most disturbing of all was his growing understanding of the true scope of the king's activities. Through careful observation and the occasional overheard conversation, Marcus pieced together a picture of a ruler who was systematically betraying his own people for personal gain. The information Catherine was forced to provide was just one piece of a larger puzzle that involved selling military secrets, manipulating trade agreements, and using her diplomatic connections to facilitate deals that would enrich the king while weakening England's position in Europe. Marcus found himself in an impossible position. His oath as a palace guard bound him to protect the king and keep the royal family's secrets. But his conscience demanded that he find a way to shield Catherine from further harm and prevent the damage that Edmund's treachery could inflict upon the kingdom. He had become a guardian not just of the palace, but of truths that could destroy everything he had sworn to protect. The weight of this knowledge pressed upon him like a physical force as he stood his nightly vigil outside the queen's chambers. He knew that other servants and guards suspected something was amiss, but none dared to speak openly about what they witnessed.
The king's reputation for dealing harshly with those who crossed him ensured that most people found it safer to remain blind to the obvious signs of trouble. Yet Marcus could not unsee what he had discovered, nor could he ignore the increasingly desperate situation in which Queen Catherine found herself.
Each day brought new demands from the king, each more dangerous than the last, and Marcus watched helplessly as the woman he had sworn to protect was slowly being destroyed by the very person who should have cherished her above all others. The first part of this story ends with Marcus standing at a crossroads that would define not only his own fate, but the future of everyone within the palace walls.
He had seen behind the mask of royal perfection and discovered a truth so terrible that it demanded action, even though that action would require him to defy everything he had been taught about duty, loyalty, and obedience to the crown. The November rain hammered against the palace windows with unusual fury, as if nature itself sensed the storm brewing within the stone walls of Raven's Hollow. Marcus had spent sleepless nights planning his next move, knowing that each day of inaction brought Queen Catherine closer to complete destruction. The bruises on her wrists, barely concealed by her long sleeves, told him that King Edmund's patience was wearing thin, and the desperation in her eyes warned him that time was running out. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus discovered the treasonous correspondence, and the situation had grown progressively worse. He had begun to document everything he witnessed, keeping careful notes hidden in a hollow space behind a loose stone in his quarters. The king's demands upon Catherine had intensified, with new letters being forced from her hand almost daily, each containing information that would compromise English interests in favor of whoever was paying Edmund the highest price for state secrets. The breakthrough came when Marcus overheard a conversation between the king and his private secretary, Lord Harrington, a thin, nervous man who had served Edmund since before his coronation.
They were discussing arrangements for Catherine's upcoming diplomatic visit to her homeland, but Marcus quickly realized this was no ordinary state visit. Edmund intended to use Catherine's emotional connection to her family as leverage to extract even more sensitive information, threatening harm to her relatives unless she expanded her intelligence-gathering activities. The Queen's cooperation has been adequate but not sufficient, Edmund's voice carried clearly through the partially open door. Her upcoming visit will provide the perfect opportunity to demonstrate what happens when my wishes are not fulfilled completely. Harrington's response was barely audible, but Marcus caught enough to understand that Catherine's parents and younger sister were to be held as implicit hostages during her visit, ensuring her complete compliance with whatever new demands Edmund chose to make.
The casual way in which the king discussed destroying an entire family sent chills down Marcus's spine and solidified his resolve to act. That evening, as Marcus stood guard outside Catherine's chambers, he made a decision that would require him to risk not only his position but his life. When he was certain no other guards were nearby, he knocked softly on the Queen's door using a prearranged signal they had developed over the past weeks. Catherine opened the door herself, having dismissed her ladies-in-waiting earlier, and the fear in her eyes told him she had already heard about the planned visit to her homeland. "Your Majesty," Marcus spoke in the barely audible whisper they used for their clandestine conversations, "I know about the visit and what the king intends. We need to discuss options that do not involve your family's destruction." But Catherine's composure, which had held strong through weeks of escalating pressure, finally cracked. Tears streamed down her face as she related the latest threats Edmund had made, including his promise to arrange accidents for her family members if she showed any further reluctance to cooperate. She had been backed into a corner from which there seemed to be no escape, and the weight of protecting both her loved ones and her conscience had pushed her to the breaking point. "I cannot save my family and preserve my soul," she whispered desperately. "Every letter I write condemns innocent soldiers to death. Every piece of information I provide weakens England's defenses. But if I refuse, Edmund will destroy everyone I care about, and he will simply find another way to accomplish his goals." Marcus had been preparing for this moment, and he presented Catherine with a plan that was dangerous beyond measure but offered the only hope he could see for breaking free from Edmund's control. He had been secretly documenting the king's treasonous activities and had made contact with certain members of Parliament who had grown suspicious of Edmund's foreign policy decisions. However, any evidence they gathered would be useless unless Catherine was willing to testify about her forced participation in the king's schemes. "The risk to you would be enormous," Marcus explained carefully. "If we move against the king and fail, neither of us will live to see another sunrise. But if we succeed, we could expose his betrayal of England and free you from this impossible situation." Catherine listened to Marcus's proposal with growing amazement, not at the audacity of the plan, but at the fact that someone was finally offering her a path that did not require her to sacrifice either her family or her principles. The plan was complex and would require perfect timing, but it offered something she had not dared hope for: the possibility of escape. The key element of Marcus's strategy involved the upcoming diplomatic visit itself. Rather than allowing Edmund to use the trip to further compromise Catherine's position, they would use it as an opportunity to gather the final evidence needed to expose the king's treachery. Catherine would pretend to comply with Edmund's expanded demands while actually working with Marcus to document every aspect of the treasonous conspiracy. However,
Implementing this plan required Catherine to place complete trust in a palace guard who was asking her to commit what would technically be treason against her own husband. The irony was not lost on either of them that they were planning to betray a king who had already betrayed his kingdom, but the legal and moral complexities of their situation offered no clear guidance.
Marcus had identified 3 key allies who could help them gather the evidence needed to present a compelling case to Parliament. The first was Catherine's personal maid Sarah, who had witnessed many of the king's abusive episodes and had access to documents that passed through the Queen's chambers.
The second was Thomas Hartwell, a clerk in the king's private office, who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the sensitive documents he was being asked to copy and distribute. The third was Captain William Ashford of the Palace Guard, Marcus's former commanding officer, who had begun to question certain orders he was receiving from the king.
The process of recruiting these allies required Marcus to reveal his own knowledge of the king's activities, effectively ending any possibility that he could return to his former position as a simple palace guard following orders without question. Each conversation was a risk that could expose their entire plan, but Marcus had come to understand that some risks were worth taking when the alternative was complicity in ongoing betrayal and abuse.
Sarah proved to be a valuable ally, having kept detailed records of Catherine's injuries and emotional state throughout her marriage. Her testimony would establish the pattern of domestic abuse that Edmund used to control his wife, providing context for Catherine's forced cooperation with his treasonous activities.
Thomas Hartwell was able to provide copies of correspondence between Edmund and foreign agents that clearly demonstrated the scope of the king's betrayal. Captain Ashford's military connections gave them access to evidence of how the information Catherine was forced to provide had been used to compromise English military positions. As they gathered evidence throughout the weeks leading up to Catherine's planned diplomatic visit, Marcus began to understand the true extent of Edmund's conspiracy. The king had been systematically weakening England's position in Europe, while enriching himself through secret deals with multiple foreign powers.
Catherine's intelligence gathering was just one component of a broader strategy that involved manipulating trade agreements, selling military information, and using diplomatic communications to coordinate activities that served Edmund's personal interests rather than England's national security. The most disturbing discovery was that Edmund had been planning to eliminate Catherine once her usefulness ended.
Documents found in Thomas Hartwell's files revealed discussions about arranging a tragic accident during the diplomatic visit that would leave Edmund free to remarry and establish new intelligence sources. The realization that Catherine's cooperation would ultimately result in her death added urgency to their efforts and confirmed that they had no choice but to move forward with their dangerous plan.
As the date of the diplomatic visit approached, Marcus and his allies finalized their strategy.
They would allow Catherine to begin the trip as Edmund intended, but they would use the journey to gather final evidence and coordinate with parliamentary allies who were prepared to act on the information they had collected.
The success of their plan depended on precise timing and the hope that they had anticipated Edmund's likely responses to their actions.
The night before Catherine's departure, Marcus stood his final watch outside her chambers as a loyal palace guard. Tomorrow, he would begin a new role as an active participant in a conspiracy to bring down the king he had sworn to serve. The transformation from dutiful soldier to revolutionary had been gradual, but the moment of truth was now at hand. Everything they had worked for would succeed or fail based on their courage to follow through with a plan that offered no possibility of retreat. Catherine spent her last night in the palace writing letters to family members she might never see again, knowing that the diplomatic visit could be either her liberation or her destruction. Marcus used the quiet hours to review every aspect of their plan, checking and rechecking the details that would determine whether they exposed a traitor or died as traitors themselves.
As dawn approached, both Marcus and Catherine faced the reality that they had committed themselves to a path from which there could be no return. The game they were about to play had stakes measured in lives and kingdoms, and the next move belonged to them. The December wind cut through the courtyard of Raven's Hollow Palace like a blade, as Queen Catherine's carriage prepared for departure. Marcus stood at attention with the other guards, his face betraying none of the tension that threatened to consume him from within.
Today would determine whether their carefully laid plans would free Catherine from King Edmund's control or result in their execution for high treason. Catherine emerged from the palace with the practiced grace of royalty, but Marcus caught the slight tremor in her hands as she accepted assistance into the carriage. Hidden beneath her traveling gown were documents that could topple Edmund's reign if they survived long enough to present them to the right people.
The irony was bitter. She was leaving on a diplomatic mission designed to further compromise her integrity, but she carried with her the evidence that could restore it. King Edmund himself appeared to see off his wife, playing the role of devoted husband with masterful precision.
He kissed Catherine's hand publicly and whispered words that appeared tender but which Marcus knew contained final threats about her family's safety. The assembled courtiers witnessed what seemed to be a loving farewell,
unaware they were watching a predator release his prey on a leash he believed unbreakable.
As the carriage rolled through the palace gates, Marcus began the most dangerous phase of their plan. Rather than remaining at the palace as a regular guard, he had obtained permission to join the Queen's security detail for the diplomatic mission. This authorization had come through Captain Ashford's influence. But Marcus knew that Edmund would become suspicious if the trip did not proceed exactly as the king had planned. The journey to Catherine's homeland took 5 days through winter roads that seemed determined to delay their progress. During the travel, Marcus used every opportunity to coordinate with their parliamentary allies who were positioned along the route. Messages passed through seemingly innocent encounters with travelers, innkeepers, and local officials who had been recruited to their cause through Captain Ashford's network of military contacts.
By the time they reached the capital city of Catherine's birth kingdom, Marcus had confirmed that everything was in place for their revelation.
Lord Pemberton, a respected member of Parliament who had grown suspicious of King Edmund's foreign policy, was prepared to present their evidence to a closed session of Parliament upon their return to England. Sir Reginald Blackwood, commander of the English garrison in the Northern Territories, had already begun investigating how intelligence allegedly gathered by Queen Catherine had been used to compromise his defensive positions.
However, the first sign that their plan might be unraveling came when they arrived at the palace where Catherine was to stay during her visit. Among the diplomats and officials waiting to greet her was Lord Harrington, King Edmund's private secretary, who had apparently traveled separately to oversee Catherine's activities personally.
His unexpected presence meant that their communications would be monitored more closely than they had anticipated, and that any deviation from Edmund's instructions would be immediately reported. Catherine handled this complication with remarkable composure, greeting Harrington as if his presence was expected and welcome.
But Marcus could see the calculation in her eyes as she adjusted their plans to accommodate this new variable. During the formal reception that evening, she managed to convey through subtle signals that she understood the increased danger and was prepared to proceed despite the additional risks.
The critical moment came on the third day of the visit, when Catherine was scheduled to meet privately with her homeland's foreign minister to discuss trade agreements that Edmund intended to manipulate for his personal benefit. This meeting was to be the centerpiece of the diplomatic mission, with Catherine expected to gather intelligence that would allow Edmund to undermine the negotiations while appearing to support them.
Instead of complying with Edmund's instructions, Catherine used the meeting to reveal the true nature of her husband's conspiracy to the foreign minister, who was himself a man of integrity who had grown suspicious of the unusual requests coming from the English court. The foreign minister's shock at learning the scope of Edmund's betrayal was matched by his immediate understanding of the danger Catherine faced by revealing the truth.
Working together, they crafted a response that would serve their mutual interests while protecting Catherine from immediate retaliation. Official documents were prepared that would appear to satisfy Edmund's demands, while actually containing false information designed to expose his treacherous network.
Meanwhile, the real intelligence about Edmund's conspiracy was secretly transmitted to Lord Pemberton through diplomatic channels that bypassed Harrington's surveillance. Marcus played his part by ensuring that Harrington received reports that supported the fiction of Catherine's compliance while actually helping to coordinate the flow of evidence to their parliamentary allies.
The delicate balance required to maintain this deception while building their case against Edmund tested every skill Marcus had developed during his years of palace service. The plan nearly collapsed when Harrington began to suspect that something was amiss.
His years of service to Edmund had made him sensitive to any deviation from expected patterns, and he noticed subtle inconsistencies in Catherine's behavior and the content of the diplomatic communications he was reviewing. On the fourth night of the visit, he confronted Marcus directly about his observations.
Guard Thornfield. Harrington spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to unquestioning obedience. I have concerns about certain aspects of this diplomatic mission that require immediate clarification.
Marcus realized that this moment would determine the success or failure of everything they had worked toward. If Harrington's suspicions were confirmed, word would reach Edmund before they could return to England with their evidence.
But if Marcus could maintain the deception for just one more day, they would have enough time to present their case to Parliament before the king could act against them. My lord, Marcus responded with the perfect tone of confused loyalty. I am not aware of any problems with the mission.
Her Majesty has conducted herself exactly as the king instructed, and all diplomatic protocols have been observed precisely. The conversation that followed was a careful dance between Harrington's growing suspicions and Marcus's practiced deflection of questions he could not answer directly without revealing their conspiracy.
Marcus drew upon every technique he had learned from managing difficult situations in the palace, presenting himself as a simple soldier who followed orders without understanding their broader implications. Ultimately, Harrington's own position worked against his ability to discover the truth.
His role as Edmund's enforcer had isolated him from other court officials, and his reputation for ruthlessness meant that few people were willing to share information with him voluntarily. Marcus was able to maintain the fiction that nothing unusual was occurring by exploiting Harrington's isolation and his assumption that fear of Edmund would prevent anyone from acting against the king's interests.
The return journey to England was tense with anticipation, as Marcus and Catherine waited to see whether their evidence would reach Parliament, before Edmund realized he had been deceived. They maintained the appearance of a successful diplomatic mission, while secretly coordinating with their allies to ensure that the revelation of Edmund's treachery would be handled in a way that protected Catherine and established her as a witness rather than a co-conspirator.
The moment of truth came 2 days after their return, when Lord Pemberton requested an emergency session of Parliament to address what he described as matters of national security requiring immediate attention. Edmund, believing the session related to foreign policy issues arising from Catherine's diplomatic mission, attended without suspicion of what was about to unfold. Marcus was present in the gallery when Pemberton rose to address Parliament with a detailed accounting of King Edmund's treasonous activities.
The evidence they had gathered was presented methodically, building from Catherine's forced participation in intelligence gathering to the broader pattern of betrayal that threatened England's security and independence.
The documentation was so comprehensive and the testimony so compelling that even Edmund's political allies found themselves unable to defend his actions.
Edmund's reaction to the accusations was immediate and violent, confirming the truth of the charges through his very attempt to deny them. His threats against Catherine, delivered in full view of Parliament, demonstrated the abusive relationship that had forced her compliance with his treasonous demands.
Captain Ashford, present as a witness, testified about the military consequences of the intelligence Edmund had sold to foreign powers, personalizing the abstract concept of treason with concrete examples of soldiers whose lives had been endangered. The king's attempts to discredit the evidence by attacking Catherine's credibility backfired spectacularly when she stood before Parliament and calmly recounted the specific threats Edmund had made against her family and the physical abuse she had endured to ensure her cooperation. The contrast between her dignified testimony and Edmund's increasingly desperate denials made clear to everyone present which person was telling the truth. Marcus watched from the gallery as the political structures he had served faithfully for 7 years crumbled under the weight of truth. The king he had sworn to protect was revealed as a traitor who had betrayed his kingdom for personal gain. The queen he had risked everything to save was finally free to speak honestly about the abuse she had suffered. The palace that had been his home was exposed as a nest of corruption that had compromised England's security and integrity. The aftermath moved with surprising swiftness. Parliament voted to remove Edmund from the throne and establish a regency under Catherine's authority until new arrangements could be made. Edmund himself was arrested and charged with high treason, his political supporters abandoning him as quickly as his crimes became public knowledge. Lord Harrington and others who had participated in the conspiracy were also arrested, their own guilt established through the documents and testimony that Marcus and his allies had gathered. For Marcus, the victory was bittersweet. He had succeeded in protecting Catherine and exposing Edmund's treachery, but the process had transformed him from a simple soldier into a man who understood the complex moral calculations required by those who serve power. His loyalty to the crown had evolved into a deeper commitment to the principles that the crown was supposed to represent, even when that meant defying the person who wore it.
Catherine's first act as regent was to pardon Marcus and his allies for their technical violations of their oaths of loyalty, recognizing that their actions had served the true interests of the kingdom even while defying its titular leader. She also established new protocols for palace guards that acknowledged their moral as well as legal obligations, ensuring that future generations would understand that true loyalty sometimes required the courage to act against orders.
Marcus remained in royal service, but his role evolved from simple obedience to active guardianship of the principles that made the monarchy worthy of loyalty. The palace that had once been a place where secrets festered in darkness became an institution committed to the transparency and accountability that democracy required. The story of the day a palace guard defied as king to shield Catherine's secrets became a testament to the truth that real courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act rightly despite that fear. Marcus Thornfield never sought to be remembered as a hero, but history recorded him as a man who understood that true loyalty serves justice rather than power, and that sometimes the greatest act of service is the courage to say no.